Okay, welcome to a new chapter, chapter 6, cellular respiration, obtaining energy from food. And I'm making a change in the lecture syllabus. I just realized, another error of mine, I put chapter 7 ahead of chapter 6 in the lecture because sometimes I think photosynthesis is a much kind of a more basic process, and you should learn that ahead of cellular respiration. But then the labs, we have fermentation coming in the week after next, and that's really a cellular respiration lab. And then after that, we have the chromatography lab, which is really a photosynthesis lab. And in this chapter, it talks about photosynthesis also. And just in the next chapter, we'll get into photosynthesis a little bit more. So I'll really talk about both in this chapter. Okay, cells of your brain burn through a quarter pound of glucose each day. And I think I may have already mentioned this. Your brain survives on glucose. It has to have glucose. Okay, for me, endurance athletes, the rate at which oxygen is provided to working muscles is the limiting factor in their performance. How fast can you get oxygen to your muscles? It's called your aerobic capacity. And we're going to talk about exercise later on, about aerobic exercise and resistance exercise. Resistance exercise makes big muscles. Aerobic exercise doesn't make big muscles. It improves the oxygen delivery system to the muscles. The maximum rate at which O2 can be taken in and used by your muscle cells, and therefore the most strenuous exercise that your body can maintain aerobically. And that is staying, aerobically means with oxygen. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And your muscles sometimes work anaerobically. If you want to work them real fast and real strong, generally you use them anaerobically. But you can only do that for a short period of time. If you want to do it for a long period of time, you got to use aerobic. And we learn that cardiovascular exercise, aerobic, it's called cardiovascular exercise also because it builds blood vessels, more and more and more blood vessels that gets more and more blood to your muscles faster and faster, and therefore supplies oxygen faster and faster. So really, exercise science is a science of getting oxygen to your muscles as fast as possible. Okay, if you work even harder and exceed your aerobic capacity, so you work so hard that you can't get oxygen to your muscles fast enough to do this level of exercise, you have to turn to fermentation. It's called lactic acid fermentation, which is an anaerobic process. And the value of that is you can really move your muscles fast. And it's a more protective mechanism in case of really emergency situation. You really have to run really fast. You're not going to be able to get oxygen to your muscles if you're running really fast. So you have to go anaerobically. But you can only do that for a short period of time. It leads to muscle fatigue. Now, aerobic exercise will eventually lead to muscle fatigue also, but after a much longer period. Anaerobic will get you to muscle fatigue really fast. For example, you lift those weights. Weightlifting is resistance exercise. It's anaerobic. So you lift up that weight and you lift it up again. And how many reps can you do before you just can't get it up over your head again? That's muscle fatigue. And you're breathing heavy, you got to replace that oxygen and replace that aerobic capacity, and then you can try it again. Okay, then metabolism will become anaerobic if you do that. And your muscles switch to an emergency mode where they break down glucose very inefficiently and make lactic acid as a byproduct, but they do it really fast, right? And that's the only real benefit of the anaerobic exercise is you can do it really fast. Okay, All life requires energy, as I mentioned, because to remain alive, you have to do work. And to do work, you need energy. Okay. So in almost all ecosystems on Earth, this energy originates from the sun. What part of it doesn't come from the sun? Well, there are in the deep sea trenches near the ocean vents. Down there are organisms that don't need the sun. They do things in a whole different way. It's really bizarre. And most of those are archaebacteria, but everybody else needs the sun. So as I mentioned, this chapter does mention photosynthesis. Plants convert the energy of sunlight to the chemical energy of sugars and other organic molecules with the use of CO2 and water. And all animals depend on this conversion for food and more. So animals depend upon photosynthetic organisms to make the food. They're the guys that make the food. We eat the food, they make the food. They also eat their own food. So they eat their food also, but we eat their food. So plants are called autotrophs. Troph is like nutrition. Autotroph means self-feeders. Organisms that make their own organic matter from nutrients that are entirely inorganic. Carbon dioxide from the air, water and minerals from the soil, and sunlight, and they make sugar. And heterotrophs means other feeders. Includes humans and other animals and fungi, and cannot make organic molecules from inorganic ones. We have to take inorganic molecules made by some other organism, and then we have to convert that into ATP. So most ecosystems depend entirely on photosynthesis for food. So plants and other autotrophs are known as producers. They produce the food. Heterotrophs, in contrast, are consumers because they obtain their food by eating plants or by eating animals that have eaten plants. So you say, well, I'm not dependent upon, I only eat meat, so I'm not dependent upon the sun. Well, yes, you are. Because you're eating an animal that ate plants, they got their energy from the sun. So you're still dependent upon the sun. And remember, animals and fungi are pure consumers. They just consume. Plants are both producers and consumers. Because remember, they make the food, but they consume their own food as well. So what chemical ingredients do plants require from the environment to synthesize their own food? CO2 from the air, water from the ground, and a couple important minerals from the soil, phosphorus and nitrogen. And that's what's in fertilizer. You fertilize your garden, you're basically putting nitrogen and phosphate on the garden. And there is a consumer, koala bear eating eucalyptus leaves. Okay, as I mentioned, the chemical ingredients for photosynthesis are CO2 and H2O. And that's the equation. They generally don't put the phosphate and the nitrogen in there. So CO2 and H2O plus sunlight makes, so those are reactants, make sugar, glucose, plus O2. And that's where the oxygen in the atmosphere came from. It's really a waste product of photosynthesis. So the autotroph is not conducting photosynthesis to make oxygen for the atmosphere. It's making glucose to support its life, to make ATP from. The oxygen is really just a waste product of photosynthesis. Okay, inside leaf cells, chloroplasts use light energy to rearrange the atoms of these ingredients to produce sugars, more importantly, glucose, and other organic molecules from the glucose. And as I mentioned, the byproduct, really a waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen gas. And at one time that was a real problem because this was first a poisonous gas. I mean, it's a very highly reactive, dangerous gas, oxygen. And the first organisms on Earth are all anaerobic. Remember, there was no oxygen in the early Earth's atmosphere. And then the first autotrophs started polluting the atmosphere with this toxic gas. And they had to figure out a way to protect themselves from it. And these are called antioxidants. But then some bacteria figured out a way to use the oxygen to make a lot more ATP than these anaerobes. And those are the precursors of mitochondria. Okay. So it's the energy flow and chemical cycling in ecosystems. Remember, you can't make energy, you can't destroy energy. You can't make matter or destroy matter, you just rearrange stuff and you recycle stuff. You know? Because remember, there's a certain number of atoms on Earth, and we use these atoms. We take them into our body and some of them leave, and we incorporate them in our body. When we die, those atoms go out. And so we're not getting any real shipments of atoms, matter from the universe, except for an occasional meteorite that hits the Earth. We're not getting any. So we got to recycle these atoms. Right? So carbon dioxide and water here, taken in by the plant, sunlight, energy enters the ecosystem, hits the leaves. In the photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast. They make glucose and oxygen. Those are used by heterotrophs here, these animals, plus the tree itself, in cellular respiration with mitochondria, aerobic metabolism with mitochondria. The first part, and also anaerobic, but that's outside the mitochondria. The aerobic part is within the mitochondria. Makes ATP to drive cellular work, and that heat energy leaves the ecosystem, and that energy to use to do work leaves the ecosystem as heat. And also the waste heat from breaking down the glucose enters the environment, and it goes up into space and just lost forever. And in cellular respiration, what are the byproducts of cellular respiration? Are CO2 and water, just what the plants need to make more sugar from. So this goes around and around and around, and energy comes into the ecosystem with the sun. It's converted to glucose. That glucose is broken down to ATP, and then ATP is burnt and converted to heat, and then that energy leaves. And that's the energy flow through the ecosystem. So energy flows into the ecosystem, is converted, is used to do work and provide heat, and then the heat leaves. Whereas matter stays within the ecosystem and just gets recycled. So energy doesn't get recycled. It comes in, flows through, and leaves. The atoms the matter is recycled over and over and over again. Okay. So cellular respiration uses oxygen to convert the energy stored in the chemical bonds of sugars to another source of chemical energy called adenosine triphosphate. Well, we know this, ATP. And in plants and animals, the production of ATP during cellular respiration occurs mainly in mitochondria. This is true in fungi also. It's also true in protistans. The waste products of cellular respiration, CO2 and H2O, the very ingredients needed for photosynthesis. Plants usually make more organic molecules than they need for fuel. This photosynthetic surplus provides material for the plant to grow, or can be stored as starch in potatoes, for example, and then we eat the potato, and we get the benefit of it rather than the plant. So, checkpoint. What is misleading about the following statement? Plants perform photosynthesis, whereas animals perform cellular respiration. And a lot of people think this. But and it's correct, but it's misleading in the fact that um, animals just perform cellular respiration, but plants do both. They do photosynthesis and do cellular respiration. Because what happens at night with a plant? Remember, a plant needs a constant supply of ATP all the time. So if there's no light, photosynthesis comes to a grinding halt and then in the nighttime. So they have to turn to cellular respiration to break down the glucose they made during when the sun was out. Unfortunately, they make more than they need, so we can get that benefit. And then when the sun comes back out again, they start photosynthesis all again. And also in the winter, right now, out there, those trees, the leaves aren't on there. They're living off of cellular respiration all winter. They're not doing photosynthesis, even though it's light, because their leaves have been withdrawn. And they'll start that when they leaf out again in the spring, they'll start photosynthesis all over again. So cellular respiration and photosynthesis are linked with each process using inputs created by the other. One major theme, pathways to transform energy and matter. This was an easy one. So cellular respiration is aerobic harvesting of chemical energy from organic fuel molecules. Well, technically, it's also anaerobic. The first part of the breakdown of glucose, and we're going to look at the breakdown of glucose first, is anaerobic, actually. And then it becomes aerobic. So the main way that chemical energy is harvested from food and converted to ATP is an aerobic process. So most of your ATP is generated aerobically. Some is generated all the time. Some of it is actually anaerobic, even if you don't go into fermentation. And so it requires oxygen. So aerobic organisms require oxygen, and that's what most organisms are, aerobic. There are a few bacteria that are, so we're obligate aerobes, so we have to breathe this stuff. Then there's obligate anaerobes, and there's only relatively few of those. They're all bacteria. They're all actually pretty dangerous, a lot of them pretty dangerous bacteria. And they're obligate anaerobes. They don't use oxygen, ever. And then there's something called a facultative aerobe that can use, that usually uses oxygen. But if you take the oxygen away from it, there's no big deal. It can live completely without oxygen if the oxygen isn't available. Right? We can live without oxygen, but only a short time. They, and these are yeast cells, when we get to that, can live indefinitely without oxygen, or indefinitely with oxygen. That's called facultative. Okay. Cellular respiration requires that a cell exchange two gases with its surroundings. The cell takes in oxygen in the form of the gas O2. It gets rid of waste as CO2. But, wait a minute. This gives kind of the impression that the gas, that the CO2 that you're breathing out, that oxygen, the CO2 is from the oxygen you breathe in. Most of it's not. Most of the oxygen that you breathe in is going to come out of cellular respiration in a molecule of water. Some of it will come out of CO2, and most of it's water. Most of the oxygen and CO2 that you breathe out came from the sugars that you ate, not from the oxygen. Excuse me. Okay, how breathing is related to cellular respiration. So we breathe, we inhale, we bring in oxygen. Well, actually, mostly we bring in nitrogen, right? And then a fair amount of oxygen, actually a little bit of CO2. But the oxygen is the important part. The oxygen is absorbed into your blood, carried by hemoglobin and red blood cells to your muscles, where the oxygen comes off the hemoglobin goes into cells, goes into the mitochondria, makes ATP for muscular contraction, right? CO2 is generated by cellular respiration. It enters blood vessels, veins. It's back into your heart, back to your lungs, and it comes out of the blood into your lungs, and you breathe it out. So that's how breathing is related to cellular respiration. All the big things depend on transformations of energy and matter. Cellular respiration consists of many chemical steps using a specific enzyme to catalyze each reaction. So it's really movement of electrons. And it's, I think I've talked about this before, oxidation. Oxidation is the loss of electrons, reduction is the gain. And so you move electrons from one molecule to the next in small chemical steps, which is really burning. That's what burning is, oxidation. So you burn your food molecules, but not like all at once in a gasoline engine or in a fireplace. You burn them in small controlled steps using enzymes to catalyze every step along the pathway. All right. It constitutes one of the most important metabolic pathways for nearly every eukaryotic cell and provides the energy these cells need to maintain the functions of life. Overview of cellular respiration. So here it is, glucose. Now, you're thinking, well, there are other energy yielding molecules. Glucose is from carbohydrates. Well, what about fats and proteins? You can use those to make ATP. And later on, we'll see how they fit into this metabolic pathway. But first, we're going to look at glucose, breakdown from carbohydrates. With oxygen, with a bunch of small steps to make CO2, H2O, and approximately 32. I think that's low. I think it's more 34, 36. 32 ATP molecules. And you can use those ATP to do work. Now, a lot of heat comes off in this process too. It doesn't show you the heat coming off. And I think about 62% of the energy inherent in that glucose molecule just comes off as heat. So heating a body is not really work. It's a byproduct of this process. And then you use the ATP, 38%. It's converted to ATP, you use that to do work. But remember, that energy also eventually becomes heat and leaves your body. The many chemical reactions that be made up of cellular respiration can be grouped into three main stages. So it's a long process, and a better way to understand it is to break it up into parts, into bite-sized pieces. The first one we look at is glycolysis. And then I'm going to add one between 1 and 2, called what I call the intermediate step. They get a long term for it in the book, but an easier way to describe it is just give it a simple name, intermediate step. And then something called the citric acid cycle inside the mitochondria. Now the glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. Citric acid cycle, and then finally electron transport, the last part, happens in the mitochondria. And oxygen is directly used in the last part, electron transport. And I think it's one of the last things that's done in cellular respiration is the use of oxygen. And most of the ATP that we make in our cells comes from electron transport, the last stage. And here is a roadmap, an overview of the whole process. So glycolysis, you break down glucose into two molecules called pyruvic acid. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. Each pyruvic acid is a 3-carbon molecule. So you make 2 of them from one glucose. And a little bit of ATP comes out right here. And this is really anaerobic. We haven't used oxygen yet. So this is anaerobically produced ATP. But it makes these high energy electron carriers up here. We're going to find out later on, this is called NADH. And they are going to be used later on in electron transport in an aerobic process. Then it's going to be an intermediate step to convert pyruvic acid to something else, which is this black arrow here. Pyruvic acid does not enter the citric acid cycle. A different molecule does that's made from pyruvic acid in a process I'm going to call the intermediate step. Then the citric acid cycle happens within what's called the matrix of the mitochondria, the inner part. And this makes a fair amount of ATP. It makes a little bit of ATP. And this is really still anaerobic. But it makes these high energy electrons here, and they're all sent to here, electron transport chain. And this happens in the inner mitochondrial membrane. The mitochondria has two membranes, outer membrane and a folded inner membrane. Electron transport happens in the folded inner membrane, and it makes a lot of ATP. Right here, that's why this is larger right here. Most of the ATP made in that third process, electron transport. So during glycolysis, a molecule of glucose is split into two molecules of a compound called pyruvic acid. It's located in cytoplasm. Citric acid cycle, also used to be called the Krebs cycle, completes the breakdown of glucose all the way to CO2. So CO2 comes out of the Krebs cycle. What happens to that CO2? It leaves the mitochondria, leaves the cell, enters a blood vessel, goes back to the heart, into the lungs, and you breathe it out. It's released as a waste product. The enzymes for the citric acid cycle are dissolved in the fluid within the mitochondria, what's called the matrix. The inner area of the mitochondria is called the matrix. Glycolysis and citric acid cycle generate a small amount of ATP and much more ATP indirectly via reactions that transfer electrons from fuel molecules to a molecule called NAD+, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It's really a B vitamin, actually. The electron transport forms a molecule called NADH. The electron transfer forms a molecule called NADH, which acts as a shuttle carrying high energy electrons from one area of the cell to the other, and actually one area of the mitochondrion to another. Okay, third stage cellular respiration, electron transport. Electrons captured from food by NADH are stripped of their energy a little bit at a time until are finally combined with oxygen to form water. As I mentioned, most of the oxygen you're breathing in is going to find its way into a molecule of water. The proteins and other molecules that make up electron transport chains are embedded within the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Electron transport from NAD to oxygen releases the energy your cells use to make most of their ATP. Overall equation, cellular respiration shows that the atoms of the reactant molecules, glucose and oxygen, are rearranged to form the products CO2 and H2O. The main function of cellular respiration is to generate ATP for cellular work. The process can produce around 32 ATP molecules for each glucose molecule consumed. Checkpoint. Which stage of cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria? Which stage takes place outside the mitochondria? Citric acid cycle, electron transport in the mitochondria, glycolysis outside the mitochondria. So during glycolysis, a 6-carbon glucose molecule is split in half to form 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Remember, pyruvic acid, 3 carbons. This initial split requires an energy investment of 2 ATP molecules per glucose. So this is like almost like activation energy. To get the ball rolling, you have to spend 2 ATP molecules. And it's almost contradictory because the whole purpose of cellular respiration, as we just mentioned, is to make ATP, not to burn ATP. But you got to invest a couple ATP to get the ball rolling. It's like in a business. You want to start a business, they always say, I know next to nothing about business, but in order to make money, first you got to spend money. Capital investment first, and then you make more money later on. Okay, so the 3 carbon molecules then donate high energy electrons to NAD plus to form NADH. Glycolysis also generates 4 ATP molecules, anaerobically called substrate level phosphorylation. Go to write that down. It's not in the book. It should be. Substrate level phosphorylation is a phosphorylation just means that you're adding a phosphate to a molecule. And that's what you do to make ATP. You add a phosphate group to ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, to make adenosine triphosphate. So it's a phosphorylation. And anaerobic phosphorylation is called substrate level phosphorylation. Okay. Glycolysis generates 4 ATP molecules per glucose molecule. But you use 2 ATPs to get the ball rolling, right? So the net gain is 2. 2 from 4 is 2. So as I said, it's a really inefficient, like in the beginning of this chapter, talking about how it's a really inefficient breakdown of glucose. But the real value of it is it's really fast. Okay, there's glycolysis. Glucose comes in, 2 ATPs are used. The glucose is split into 2 of these molecules here. They're converted, phosphates are added to them. High energy electrons are taken away from them, so they are oxidized. So this is a good example of what's called a redox reaction. Remember, when you take electrons from one molecule, you got to give it to another molecule. The molecule that you've taken it from has been oxidized. The molecule that you've given the electrons to has become reduced. So this molecule here is being oxidized to this molecule here, and NAD plus is being reduced to NADH. And then there's a bunch of conversions of these molecules down here. And the process, 2 ATPs are made here and 2 are made here for a total of 4. And then pyruvic acid comes out as the final product. So remember, you have 2 reactions going on here in glycolysis coming from one glucose molecule, right? Because it's split into 2. Okay. Energy investment spends 2. Energy harvest process produces 4. Net gain 2 per glucose molecule. So this, then again, in the stage 2 citric acid cycle. Before pyruvic acid can be converted, can be used by citric acid cycle, it must be converted to form a citric acid cycle. It must be converted to a form that citric acid cycle can use. Like I said, pyruvic acid is not the entry molecule to the mitochondria, to the citric acid cycle. You have to do what's called the intermediate step. I'm calling this stage 2 of the citric acid cycle. It's not really a citric acid cycle, not yet. You have to convert pyruvate to a molecule that can enter the citric acid cycle. And that I'm calling the intermediate step. So remember that, write that down because it's not in the book. Each pyruvic acid loses a carbon as CO2. So a CO2 molecule is pushed off as a waste product there. The remaining few molecules with only 2 carbons, that's called acetic acid. Electrons are stripped from these molecules and transferred to NAD+, forming NADH. This is important. Whenever you make an NADH, you got to note it, because later on, these NADHs are going to be shipped over to electron transport, and that's where we get most of our ATP from oxidizing these NADH molecules. Finally, each acetic acid is attached to coenzyme A to form what's called acetyl-CoA. And that's the ticket to the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle. That's the molecule that can enter the citric acid cycle. And acetyl-CoA is another B vitamin, pantothenic acid. Matter of fact, the book doesn't mention this, but most of this is supported by the B vitamins. That's one of the major roles of B vitamins, is to support cellular respiration and is needed to run cellular respiration. So they're calling it the link between glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, the conversion of pyruvic acid to acetyl-CoA. It's a long name. So that's why I want to give it a shorter one and call it the intermediate step between glycolysis and citric acid cycle. Okay. And there it is. Pyruvic acid loses a carbon in CO2. Acetic acid left over. We oxidize acetic acid and we reduce NAD plus to NADH. A coenzyme A is added to it to make acetyl-CoA. And that's the output of the intermediate step, and that is going to be the input to the citric acid cycle. And one thing that's important to, I should have mentioned this earlier, one thing that's important for you to know is the input to these processes and the outputs. All right? What molecules go into the process, what molecules come out of the process. So pyruvic acid would be an input molecule to the intermediate step. CO2 would be an output molecule, right? Coenzyme A would be an input molecule. NAD plus would be an input molecule. NADH would be an output molecule. And acetyl-CoA is an output molecule of this particular process. All right. I'm going to, okay, let's get this citric acid cycle done, and then we'll stop it before electron transport, because that's a more complicated thing, and we're going to put that in the next video. So citric acid cycle finishes extracting the energy of sugar by dismantling the acetic acid molecules all the way down to CO2. So you end up with 3 CO2 molecules per pyruvate. And pyruvate is a three carbon molecule, so those carbons are gone. So acetic acid joins a 4-carbon acceptor molecule to form a 6-carbon molecule called citric acid. Why they call it that? For every acetic acid molecule that enters the cycle is fueled, 2 CO2 molecules eventually exit, a waste product, and along the way, a citric acid cycle harvests energy from the fuel. So here it is, citric acid cycle. See, input on this side, output on this side. And go around and around. So the acceptor molecule accepts the acetic acid from citric acid cycle. ADP is an input molecule. NAD plus is also an input molecule, 3 of them, and something called flavin adenine dinucleotide, another electron acceptor. It acts the same way as NAD plus. And it's also another B vitamin, riboflavin. So the output molecules are 2 CO2s come off as waste products, 3 ATPs that are made by substrate level phosphorylation. And that's 1 ATP. I'm sorry, that 3 is steps. So it's 2 CO2s, 1 ATP per cycle of the citric acid cycle, 3 NADHs, one FADH2 that where the FAD picks up the electrons, it becomes FADH2. And the reason you gotta be sure about the numbers of these molecules are made, because later on we could do an accounting of these and find out where all these ATPs come from. Some of this energy is used to produce ATP directly in the citric acid cycle, substrate level phosphorylation. However, the cycle captures much more energy in the form of NADH and another closely related electron carrier called FADH2. All the carbon atoms that enter the cycle as a few are accounted for as CO2 exhaust, and the 4 carbon acceptor molecule is recycled, picks up another acetic acid, and may go around again and again. And remember, for the accounting purposes, how many times does the citric acid cycle go around per glucose molecule? Twice. Goes around twice for every glucose molecule, because every glucose that's broken down by glycolysis makes 2 pyruvates, 2 acetyl-CoAs, 2 cycles of the citric acid cycle, 2 rounds of the citric acid cycle. Okay, we're gonna stop right here and pick up stage 3 on the next video. So it's going to be 106 respiration 1. So catch you in the next video.